Today's gospel is the second prediction of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. And so Jesus begins the disciple through Galilee, teaching the disciples, telling them the Son of Man is to be handed over to men. They would kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. But they didn't understand the saying. You know, one of the things about it is that we think about the disciples, and while certainly not all Jews felt that there was going to be a political Messiah, certainly, and especially in the third prediction of his passion, when James and John, or the mother of James and John, come up to Jesus and say, you know, we want those prime positions, we want the positions at your left and your right when you come into the kingdom. In other words, we want the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State. We don't want the lesser positions. We want the big positions. And so if all of them had that kind of a thought, you know, that Jesus was going to come into his kingdom, he was going to throw out the Romans, he was going to create a state somewhat like David and be that wonderful King Messiah like David, then why didn't they ask questions? You know, because what the predictions of his passions were kind of going against what they had thought. So if it's going against what they thought, I think unfortunately one of the normal things to do is just throw out that outlier. You know, don't worry about that piece of data that's there. You know, in the case of Jesus, it was, you know, his passion, his death, and resurrection, because we're full steam ahead onto the creating the kingdom. And so if you're full steam ahead, then you just kind of forget that outlier, or you just kind of hope it goes away. But you don't ask questions because you don't want to look foolish. And I think that's the unfortunate thing, is why didn't they ask the questions? You know, you're having two positions that are coming into direct conflict with one another. Why didn't you ask the question? Well, I think A, they didn't want to look foolish, and B, it's kind of that human nature to kind of just throw away the outlier. And then, when he comes into the house, he said, you know, what were you arguing about the way? But they remained silent because they were discussing who was the greatest. So Jesus is talking about his passion, death, and which should lead to either sadness or questioning as to what does it mean will rise, you know, should lead to, you know, sorrow, questioning. But instead, they were discussing who was the greatest. So again, that idea of when he comes into his kingdom, who's going to get the best positions, who's ranked near the top, you know, who's up there near the top, who's ranked at the bottom, you know, where am I, you know, in jockeying for position. And so what Jesus does is that he takes the child and places it in their midst. And again, when we think about the children at the time of Jesus, really had no standing. Because so many of the children, when they would be born, would die fairly quickly. In childbirth, or slightly after childbirth, or a few years after childbirth, because they didn't have the kind of medications that they have today. And not having the medications that they have, so many of them died. And so if they could actually live beyond just that period of time of, you know, early childhood, early development, from the infancy to the toddler to the growing up stage and coming into near teenage years, then they would receive their standing, because after all, now they were considered that they would actually live for a while. And again, some people lived at the time of Jesus still into their 70s and 80s, but certainly a much, much, much smaller number than we have today. But there were some who were able to live long lives. There were others, most of them were able to live into their 30s or 40s. So again, getting past early childhood was when they received their standing. So what he does is takes a child, places in their midst, says, whoever receives this child, my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. And so again, that idea of humility. When we think about a child, we can think about, you know, some of the bad things, you know, the me's of the, you know, the or the no's, or the no's of the 2-year-old saying no, or the me. That's mine. That don't want to share. That's mine. But we also think about sometimes of that, of the wonderful things about childhood, and that loving kind of love that the child has to the parents, that they were willing to give them a hug or something. The fact that sometimes they will be obedient and will do exactly what the parent wants them to do. Sometimes they need to be coaxed, but again, sometimes they will certainly do what the parent wants them to do. They'll take out the trash or do what the parent wants them to do. And so really, when we consider our relationship with God, it really is kind of that love and obedience, that love that we want to love God, more than just the things of this world or the passing things of this world. But we also want to have that obedience to God's will, to not just do whatever we want to do, but to take things to prayer. And if it's truly important, take things to prayer and fasting, that we may find out how we feel and how we're thinking about, is it resonating with us? Is there some disquiet in our hearts? How is it when we take it to prayer? So again, that obedience that we see. The other thing is that there's that trust in a child. The child trusts that the parent is, going to help them to go across the street, and not going to say, go for it, just leave them alone and have them make their way across the street, but actually going to help them. And I think that that's the other thing that's in our lives, that love, that obedience, and that trust, that God is indeed faithful and is willing to guide us in our lives. Thanks, and God bless.